Welcome to our Photoshop tutorial series. This is on lesson 3 in the Adobe CS2 book titled Basic Photo Corrections. In this lesson, we will take a look at the following topics: talking about image size and resolution, cropping and straightening an image, assuming that it was scanned in, adjusting tonal ranges, color casts, brightness and saturation of areas, using the unsharp mask, using sponge and dodge tools. I already have the lesson 3 start Photoshop open. So while you're getting that open, I am going to give you a quick discussion on resolution and image size. If you take a look at this dialog box here for a minute, you'll notice that this picture is sized in theory at 6 centimeters by 8 centimeters. So perhaps this area here, between my thumbs, top and bottom of the paragraph text, would be how big that picture is in real life at 203 dots or pixels per inch. Notice that there's a sizing here with the resolution, but there's also something on top here about pixel dimensions. And that basically talks about how many squares or pixels or dots on the screen make up the image. So in theory, this thing is 508 wide by 711 tall. If we change our resolution to 100 pixels per inch, then the actual dimensions of that photo increase to maybe double to this size. But that's going to give you a very poor resolution picture, and as you can see, you're going to get the staircase effect right there. When you go to print, generally, most printers will run images at 300 dots per inch, which brings us down to something like this. And if you were a high quality laser printer, you might be sitting at 600 dots per inch. And now we're at something like this. Where the problem comes is when people want to use pictures off social media like Facebook, which are set up at 72 dots per inch. Didn't mean to hit enter there. So something that looks almost screen size ends up printing as something that's almost thumbnail size. Just keep in mind what you're going to do with your picture when it's a final project. Sometimes it's important to save a Photoshop file of that project or picture so you can use it in a different application later, and then actually save as something with lower resolution if you want to put it up on the web. I better change this back to the 203 that was sitting there and hit enter, and now we're ready to start our lesson. If you want to read more on it, page 87 and 88 in your text there in your tutorial book. Okay, the crop tool, beginning on page 90. It's found in the top area here. Click and drag to apply it. And if you hit enter, it executes the crop command. If you don't hit enter, it does give you the opportunity to grab the corners or edges to resize. If you run the mouse off the corner, instead of having a straight arrow, it gives you a bent arrow, which allows you to actually rotate your crop so that you can rotate the crop to match the layout or side of one of the images of your image that you're trying to crop, the orientation. And then when you have that matched, you can pull in the corners and hit enter to execute the command. So now I've straightened out my image. The other thing I'd like you to notice here, again, we have that options bar that comes across the top when you're using the tool. I'm not using the tool here right now per se, so I don't have widths and heights there. We are now at page 93, where we're going to make some adjustments to our image. So image adjustments and auto color is basically going to spread the colors of the image out a little bit more so there's a little more definition there. We're going to go to Image, Adjustments, Shadow and Highlight. I always like to see the More Options area. And this area gives you an opportunity to take dark spots and lighten them up so you can see what the detail is that's buried in underneath the shadow spot, and also a spot where there's a little extra sun or too bright. You can tone it down by adding some dark to and allowing you to see the detail that would have been buried underneath that. When you see something that looks good and you're happy with it, and this is an eyeball thing, and also it depends a little bit on the monitor too, a little bit, you click OK to run the dialog and close that command. And then over on page 95, we get to look at levels. Part 2 here's levels. Levels basically talk about which pixels are displayed as white and which pixels are displayed as black. Now this is a histogram displaying all the range of the colors in my picture. The height of this is more of them, less of them. And if I push it like this, that says that everything in this thing that used to be white or close to white will now be printed or shown as displayed as white. If I pull this one up, anything that is below this will now be set at black or darker. If I play with the middle, it adjusts the gray point and which pixels would be gray, or which lighter pixels would now be gray. When you find something that your eyeball likes, click OK. That brings us to page 97. Color casts. When you play with the levels, sometimes you end up getting too much red in there, so you can again use the auto color to pull out the extra red. We're at the stage now on page 99 where it wants us to run with replacing the color. Rather than replacing or working with all the yellows in the picture, we're going to focus on just this one tulip. So I'm going to use the rectangular marquee tool and just drag in and pull in a box around it. Then I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, and Replace Color. This area here is similar to the marquee tools in that you can add and take away from the selection. It also has a different functionality to it in that there's something here about fuzziness. And fuzziness is something I'd like you to remember when you get to using the this tool here. Basically, at a click, it picks up or determines how much would get picked up around it. Notice that right now there's not a lot being picked because I've reduced the selection area to being inside of this box. If I'd gone select, deselect, Image, Adjustments, and Replace Color, I can pick in this here. I can play. You can see I can pick up an awful lot more of that particular image with one click. And by the way, that tool was called Magic Wand. So I'm going to cancel this. I'm going to go back in, make my selection, Image, Adjustments, Replace Color. Fuzziness is fine. I'm going to click in the yellow. I'm going to add to my yellow selection. I can click here. And notice as I click more yellow in here, I add to my selected area. I can also click within this area here, which is actually kind of handier because you can see in black and white what has and has not been selected. When you're happy with your selection, we can move on to the hue, saturation, and lightness part of our replacement. Hue boils down to what color you're going to replace with. So it used to be yellow, it could be orange-ish, red, magenta, blue, etc. I'm going to find a nice magenta color. Saturation talks about how much of that magenta paint there sits. No magenta paint means a gray image. Lots and lots of it makes a very, very almost too bright magenta. It's nice to put in a little extra perhaps. Lightness talks about how much white paint you add or dark paint. Basically the tone of the color. And I'm just going to leave that one in a neutral position at 0. And if I'm happy with it, I'm going to click OK. And as I'm finished, I'm going to go select and deselect from my image. And that runs us all the way through to the end of page 101. Adjusting lightness with the Dodge tool, page 101. The Dodge tool is found on your toolbox in the bottom section here of the retouch area underneath the sponge. Actually, Dodge tool is by default on top. So I got that one set. You notice you can change the brush size by dragging the diameter back and forth. We determine how big an area you're working with. If you want, you can also select in here. Turning the page, it wants us to pick 27 pixels for size. We're going to leave the hardness alone. We can change highlights, midtones, or shadows depending what area you want to work with. We're going to work with highlights, and you can set exposure either on the slider or by typing it in and hitting enter to 15. And we're just going to mouse over this statue here and pick off some of the extra junk and hopefully see a little more detail. When you're happy, you stop using the tool. Next step, saturation. Sponge tool has two effects. We can saturate, add paint color to, or we can desaturate, take paint color from. We can set how effective or how much happens in one mouse over, or we can also set the tool size. So if I was to demonstrate that, I can set to desaturate, and I can run the mouse over this flower a number of times here, and you can see that I eventually will turn this red flower into something gray as I remove the red color with the desaturate tool. If I go to saturate, I can add color. So I'm going to add color to this by clicking or click and drag over this yellow flower and just bring it up a little bit. Or if you wanted to, you could even make your tool brush size quite a bit bigger. I'm going to cut back the flow rate a little bit because I don't want to do that much to it. But I'm just going to run it over the picture in general just to give it a little tweak. And that runs us through to the top middle of page 103, where you could again save your work. The textbook asks us to use the sharpen and unsharp mask. The job of this tool is to emphasize differences between color areas on the picture. That will remove blurriness to some extent. It's a good idea to run preview. If you wish, you can zoom in on areas. Then you can play with the amounts. You can play with the radius and levels. I try generally to, when I'm using this, to keep amounts, radiuses, and thresholds down. I usually use a threshold of 1 or 2 or 3. Radius I keep small, and the textbook asks us to run it up to 62. It's a matter of what looks good. And when you're happy, you click OK. And then we get over into page 106, 107. And this is the point where you need to think about what you're actually going to do with your image. Our textbook here asks us to change from RGB mode, which is color monitor mode, red, green, blue, to CMYK, which is chromium, magenta, yellow, and black color mode. So it prints better perhaps. And in most cases, you would go File, Save As, and either save it as a JPEG to move it, or a TIFF. If I remember correctly, a TIFF will allow a transparent background if necessary, whereas a JPEG forces either a white or a black background into your picture when you export as or save as transparent. I'm not going to save because that's going to spoil my tutorial pictures in there, so I'm just going to go cancel and just assume that you know how to hit save when you've picked one of those file types, and that you also know how to name the files if you need to. Thank you very much for watching this tutorial. Look forward to showing you lesson number 4, which is about retouching and repairing images.